Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and today I want to share my thoughts on two of my um, almost favorite motherboards. Yeah, that's the best way to put it. Almost favorite. Because the thing is, this is gonna be a bit of a rant of a video, but like this is because it's like we were so close to finally having a motherboard where I'm not gonna have anything to like complain about, and then it's just like, oh wait a minute. So the motherboards I'm talking about are the B550 Aorus Master and the MSI B550 Unify-X. So the first, and the funny thing is, they actually share one of my least favorite features to be introduced on a B550 motherboard. So both of these boards have way too many PCIe 4.0 M.2 slots. Right, so this board has three PCIe 4.0 M.2 slots, and the B550 chipset doesn't support any PCIe 4.0 M.2 slots. This board has also got three 4.0 slots and then one 3.0 slot at the bottom, which hangs off of the chipset. Now, the problem I have with this is that M.2 slots are just a less flexible connector than PCIe slots, right? You can't convert an M.2 slot back in, like, you can't take two M.2 slots and convert them back into a PCIe X8 slot. But you can take a PCIe X8 and convert it into two M.2 slots. You can take a PCIe X8 and convert it into LAN or Wi-Fi or SATA ports or USB ports or Thunderbolts or literally anything you can audio. Like, if you make a sound card, like that's PCIe to audio on the output, right? Like you're converting the PCIe connector to audio. Or you can do PCIe to video with the graphics card, the most common use of PCIe. And the thing is just like, yeah, well, you can't convert M.2 slots back into usable length PCIe slots, unfortunately. And the way both of these boards achieve all of these PCIe 4.0 M.2 slots is by taking PCIe lanes from the CPU, which you only have 16 of for general use, right? Like technically the CPU has 24 lanes, but like 4 of them are reserved for an SSD, 4 of them are reserved for the chipset. And so ultimately the CPU actually only has like 16 usable PCIe lanes if you care about things that, well, go into PCIe slots that don't happen to be SSDs. And even if you do care about things that are SSDs, you only get 20 usable lanes. So anyway, both of these boards take 8 of your PCIe lanes from your GPU and they stuff them into M.2 slots. But the thing is just, and like, I really don't like that because it just fundamentally restricts how much functionality you can get out of the motherboard. Because let's say you, instead of taking those X8s, like those X8 PCIe lanes, right? Instead of taking those 8 PCIe lanes from the CPU and turning them into M.2 slots, what if you just turned them into another PCIe slot, right? Like a normal motherboard would do. Well then, if I really wanted more M.2 SSDs, I could just buy a PCIe to M.2 adapter card. Isn't that an idea? But also, if I didn't care about having a bajillion SSDs, I could run SLI. Or I could have, like, because there's sometimes you get devices that really don't like running off of chipsets. Well, you could plug in one of those things into your CPU lanes. And admittedly, it'll take your GPU, your main PCIe slot down to X8, but that's just a fundamental restriction of the Ryzen CPUs, so there's not really anything the motherboard can do about that. So basically, it's just like, as far as I'm concerned, a motherboard should be focused on offering as much flexibility as possible, not less. And M.2 slots are less flexible than PCIe slots, therefore I don't like M.2 slots. Also, there's a bit of a factor of like, I saw the score that like I ran 3D Mark Firestrike on my 5950X. I was very impressed by the CPU physics score, and then I got really excited about like benching a bunch of GPUs, multi-GPU setups with my 5950X, and then I had to take a look at which, and then I was like, ooh, I wonder what motherboard I'm going to run it on. And then it hit me that both of the best motherboards that I have for memory overclocking can't actually do SLI at all. It's not physically possible to run SLI on these motherboards unless you want to run it through the chipset, which is not ideal. And also you'll need to hack the drivers because NVIDIA's drivers don't support running SLI on anything less than an X8 slot. So yeah, that's great. That's exactly what I wanted. So yeah, thank you MSI for forcing me to use the godlike again, which is just worse at memory overclocking than the Unify-X. And then the same goes for, and like, well, actually with Gigabyte, if I had an X570 Aorus Master, I could use that, like the new revision. Because the problem with the Gigabyte side of things is I have an X570 Aorus Extreme, but I have the original revision, which isn't as good at memory overclocking as the B550 Aorus Master. Whereas like the 1.1, 1.2 revision master is on par with like the B550 master, and then the X570 Extreme 1.1 is also on par with the like the B550 Aorus master. So yeah, that's great. I'm like, I'm so happy about that. Just like, okay, well, I guess I'm gonna have to use this thing, or I could use an X570 Unify, which actually is, if I remember correctly, even a smidge worse at memory overclocking than the godlike. So that's like really great. You know, it's just like, ooh, I have these two really great overclocking boards. It's just a real shame I can't run Firestrike on them because they don't have enough PCIe slots. Even though, like, the expensive part of doing the extra M.2 slots is the PCIe switches. So most of the, like, this board's $250, this board's $300. A lot of that cost is literally just those PCIe switches. And the redrivers, because PCIe 4.0 is very expensive. Like, fun fact, you can't get a AM4 motherboard with PCIe switches for less than like $250. And the cheapest one is this. So if you want a motherboard that actually has like SLI support, so X8, X8, you have to buy like a B550 Vision, which we'll get to that board, because that board's kind of... Ooh, I should have pulled up that board. Okay, well, we'll pull up the B550 Vision just for a comparison against the Master. So, anyway, yeah. Oh man, this is very white. Anyway, so that's my first complaint for both of these boards, is just like PCIe slots are just superior to M.2 slots, because at the end of the day, I can always convert PCIe slots back into M.2 slots. I can't do it the other way around. Now, I guess most people might not agree with... Well, I don't know. Like, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But in my opinion, like, PCIe lanes are just better than M.2 slots. And if you need more M.2 slots, buy an adapter card. Or if the motherboard vendor wants to market the motherboard as having a support for a ridiculous number of PCIe, like M.2 SSDs, just include a basic adapter card. And when I say a basic adapter card, I mean not this thing. Okay, that right there, yeah, I can understand how that ends up only being included with $700 motherboards, because that is a lot of very, like, that's expensive to do, having that massive heatsink, right? But it's just like, well, I'm not sure how expensive... I'd assume most of the cost of that card is actually in the heatsink. Just fun fact. Like, you don't need the freaking heatsink, especially since a lot of the high-end SSDs come with their own heatsinks. And there's aftermarket heatsinks, so it's just like, just have a very basic adapter card for extra M.2 slots. Also, like, this heatsink is just ridiculous compared to what the motherboard has on board anyway. So, you know, just a basic PCIe to M.2 adapter card as part of the accessory package. And then you can, you know, go like, yeah, we have support for 3 PCIe 4.0 SSDs out of the box. Because you technically do, you just need to use the add-in card. The only awkward thing I can think of is just if you use standard sort of PCIe slot spacing, that adapter card is potentially going to block off airflow to a GPU. So you might want to put like that bottom PCIe, like the extra, like the X8 slot should be like all the way down here instead of here, which would be where it normally would go, I think. Yeah, because 1, 2, yeah. So you'd want to like move it down another slot towards the bottom of the board. And anyway, yeah. So that's the M.2 thing, which I just find super frustrating, because now like I can't use like 2 of my almost favorite motherboards, can't use them because they don't have enough PCIe slots for what I want to do with them, and that's really frustrating. That's just really frustrating. Anyway, the other thing, so with the Unify, there's a few features that I feel are missing from the Unify, and sort of the most missing feature, in my opinion, is dual BIOS. This board is targeted at extreme overclocking and, well, just overclocking enthusiasts in general. So much so that it gives up a bunch of memory slots so that it can be better at memory overclocking. You know what's also really useful to helpful to do with when it comes to memory overclocking? Having the ability to test different BIOS versions against each other. And that is made much more convenient when you have dual BIOS with a switch, like the X570 Godlike has, right? The Godlike has a switch down here, and that allows you to switch between two different BIOS chips. So what you can do with that is you can install two different BIOS versions, right? And compare which BIOS version is better at memory overclocking or CPU overclocking or performance or whatever the hell it is you want to compare. You can compare it between two BIOS versions without having to flash the BIOS on the motherboard every time you want to see if a certain version is better, right? Like, you don't have to constantly flash back and forth, which is super annoying. And the thing is, especially with Ryzen, the ability to, like, risk-free test a new BIOS on a secondary BIOS chip is super convenient, because I've run into multiple occasions where you update the BIOS and the memory overclocking gets worse. Like, way worse. I remember there's like a certain BIOS version for the B550 Aorus Master where 3600 CL14 literally just doesn't work. It is not possible to boot 3614 with any of my memory sticks whatsoever. But if you go back like a couple versions, or maybe just one version, I didn't check every single BIOS version. I just went to a BIOS version that I considered known good. And so, so I rolled back to another BIOS version, 3600 CL14 works immediately. So, because, so to be able to avoid that kind of thing, it's nice to have dual BIOS with a switch. And it's a feature that I think would make a lot of sense to have on an extreme overclocking focused motherboard like the B550 Unify-X, right? Like, whereas, like, it's present on the X570 Godlike, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a really overpriced gaming board that just so happens to be kind of good at overclocking. That's literally my evaluation of the Godlike. Very overpriced. Actually, it's I don't even consider it that great a gaming board. So, like, ultimately just, like, really overpriced motherboard that just so happens to be kind of good at overclocking and has a kind of useful PCIe slot layout. Anyway, so, well, the funny thing is, like, the board itself is not overpriced in that it costs more, like, the price doesn't make sense relative to the hardware that's on there. It's just, like, the hardware that is there doesn't make sense. Like, yes, I can understand how this is a $700 motherboard. I don't understand why they decided to build this, but I can understand why it costs so much. This is still a dumb mix of features, especially the rear I/O. Anyway, so the Unify-X probably should have had the dual BIOS that the Godlike has, right? Probably. The other thing that would have been neat to have on the Unify-X is these two buttons down here, because the Godlike has two buttons that allow you to raise the BCLK up and down. In hardware, they just control the clock gen, so you don't need to install any software in Windows or anything. You can just raise the BCLK with those two buttons, which is super convenient. Can't do that on the Unify-X. It would have been really nice to have something like that on the Unify-X, considering it's an extreme overclocking focused motherboard, right? Like for doing memory frequency validations, that kind of thing. This is a really helpful feature for that kind of application. But instead we get it on the Godlike, which, if I remember correctly, doesn't even have VTT DDR control. So this thing this thing is literally incapable of maxing out all of my memory sticks because it just doesn't have the necessary voltage ranges, if I remember correctly. This, on the other hand, does have VTT DDR control, but it doesn't have the BCLK adjustment buttons, which is just like, and I don't think they're like a super necessary feature. I'm really much more annoyed about the lack of dual BIOS, which is why I brought that one up first. But, it's like, well, this is a cool feature that would make more sense here than it makes there, like here, right? So anyway, and the last thing I'd like to point out is, so this is an extreme overclocking motherboard, but there's no voltage read points. Whereas this is an overpriced gaming board, and admittedly, I'm not a fan of the way the voltage read points are implemented. They're like super cramped together, and it's kind of hard to tell which one you're trying to probe. But And this board doesn't really have that much space to put the voltage read points. Well, I guess they could have probably squeezed them in somewhere in this area. But, yeah, like voltage read points would have been nice. And they're like the least important feature, in my opinion, on the list of things for extreme overclocking. Because it's like voltage read points, you don't, like, I don't have a multimeter hooked up to my motherboard constantly. Because it's basically pointless. Like, that's basically pointless to do. But it is helpful if you're, like, sometimes there's, like, BIOS bugs where the BIOS doesn't apply the voltages the way you set them. And it's really helpful to have voltage read points for those kinds of scenarios because you can check if the board is actually doing what you told it to do. Because sometimes, there are certain BIOS versions where, you'll try set the memory voltage and then you'll find out it doesn't set it during training. So it doesn't train certain settings that should work because you're booting at 1.2 volts instead of 1.5. Which is a pretty big problem depending on the kind of settings you're trying to run. And admittedly, you can, troubleshoot that kind of issue by just stabbing the appropriate inductor with a multimeter, but voltage read points would make that a little bit more convenient. So, yeah, this board is kind of like, I feel like especially the dual BIOS should have been present. The BCLK buttons and the voltage read points would have been kind of like, the BCLK I would probably actually make use of. The voltage read points are more are the most optional as far as I'm concerned. So, yeah, those things, but especially the dual BIOS would have made this like so much nicer a motherboard to work with, just so much nicer. But instead it just has a single BIOS because, and the thing is, like, it's a $300 board. There's no reason it couldn't have dual BIOS, as far as I'm concerned. So, anyway, Gigabyte, on the other hand, has the opposite issue. So the biggest problem I have with this board right here is the dual BIOS. See, because the way Gigabyte implemented dual BIOS on the B550 Aorus Master here is we have the two BIOS chips, and then pay especially close attention to the area around the post, sort of above the post code, right? Yeah. You'll notice some things missing over there, like these two switches. So what those two switches do, right, is they allow you to put the board into single BIOS mode and then manually choose which BIOS chip you're using. So essentially, because of Gigabyte's incredibly boneheaded dual BIOS functionality, you need two switches to achieve the same level of functionality that MSI has with one, which is that's great. And I've pointed this out to Gigabyte. It doesn't make sense to do this at all. But apparently, for some reason, they're just never going to implement dual BIOS any other way than with the automatic switching functionality, which is just like, that is, like, there's never ever been a scenario in which I've been like, oh, yay, my motherboard automatically switched to the backup BIOS chip. Like, it's never been a scenario where I've been actually pleased that my motherboard has done that. Which is also the main reason why every motherboard that I have from Gigabyte that does have the dual BIOS switches, the first thing I do when I take the motherboard out of the box is put it into single BIOS mode, because the automatic dual BIOS mode is incredibly frustrating. Because what it does is, basically, if you've crashed too many times during startup, it'll randomly throw you to the other BIOS chip. Not even like specifically the backup one, because if you're on the backup one and you crash on the backup one a bunch of times, it'll throw you back onto the main one. Which is just like, and every time it does that, all of your settings disappear. You get shoved onto whichever BIOS version you have flashed on each chip. Your BIOS profiles are tied to a specific BIOS chip, so you lose all of those every time the BIOS switches over. And the only way to get back to the main BIOS chip is to remove 5-volt standby power from the motherboard. There's two ways of doing that. Either you switch off your power supply and then wait for the 5-volt standby rail to, discharge and turn off, which on some power supply, on some PSUs, that's pretty quick. On some other PSUs, that takes like a minute. Okay? I don't want to sit there waiting for my motherboard, waiting for a minute for my motherboard to switch back to the useful, the correct BIOS chip. Or the other option is to unplug the 24 pin. I think we can all agree that unplugging the 24 pin and then plugging it back in again is not a good solution to the issue, because that connector is like the worst connector to work with on a motherboard. So basically, Gigabyte should have done one of two things. Either they should have included the switches like they did on the X570 Master, or they should have done what they did on the Vision D and just not had dual BIOS in the first place. Because this board is actually just, like, less annoying to work with when it comes to overclocking. Because it doesn't randomly kick you back to the backup BIOS chip. And what I find so frustrating about this is the number of times I've had people complain about, like, Gigabyte motherboards losing settings or reverting to old BIOS versions on, like, you know, forums and Discord and that kind of thing. Like, I've seen that, well, mostly Reddit these days, but still, like, the number of times I've seen people complain about that is way too high. Gigabyte's automatic dual BIOS is a freaking anti-feature. It actively makes the product worse. Because to most people, when your BIOS randomly goes from the main BIOS chip to the backup BIOS chip, like, their settings are gone, and if they didn't update the, like, if the BIOS versions are different between what they have on the backup chip and the main chip, then they're like, oh, my motherboard rolled back BIOS versions, where did all my profiles go? Like, you can see how that gets extremely annoying, and the motherboard does that every time it fails to post too many times in a row. So if you're doing, like, memory overclocking, or, you know, worse, let's say you're a beginner, you enable an XMP profile that doesn't work, and then suddenly you're put onto the backup BIOS chip, which is like 3 versions out of date or something. Might not even necessarily support your CPU depending on when exactly you bought the motherboard, right? Like, yeah, that sounds like a very good user experience, you know? That sounds like exactly the kind of behavior you would want from a motherboard. So, yeah, and like that right there, that boneheaded dual BIOS implementation is the main reason I don't recommend the B550 Aorus Master. It's not even the M.2 slots. Like, I find that annoying, but there's a lot of people who might actually consider that a useful feature. But Gigabyte's automatic dual BIOS is never a useful feature. It's just an annoyance. Like, actually, no, I think there was like one series of motherboards where it was kind of useful. But it's not like you couldn't replicate that functionality by just having a freaking dual BIOS switch. Right? Like, again, it's just like, if for some reason you corrupted the main BIOS, you could just flick the switch, go to the backup one. Oh, isn't that an idea? So, yeah, that, like, and the funny thing is, on the Z490 boards, Gigabyte doesn't have this issue. Like, they didn't do it. And also the Vision D, which is actually more expensive than the Master. This thing's like $260. Yeah, this doesn't have a second BIOS chip, and it also doesn't need the switches as a result of that. But the thing is, the Vision D has a significantly worse VRM than the Master, the B550 Master. Actually, the B550 Master has a better VRM than the X570 Master, just fun fact. So, you know, it's like, so this could have been a really great, like, overclocking board at the $250 price point, except it isn't, because if you try to overclock memory, it's going to kick you onto the backup BIOS chip randomly every so often. And that's super frustrating. Like, you can definitely live with it. And, you know, I've put up with it just fine. It's not... and, well, actually, no. I've put up with it, but I want to disable I want to implement my own BIOS switches. Like, I want to figure out how this works and re-implement it myself, like, implement that on my board as well. Or I might just do something to cut 5-volt standby power, which actually that's probably going to be way more difficult than just figuring out how to get the BIOS chips to switch back over. But anyway, like, yeah, this is dumb. This is an anti-feature. Don't do this to your motherboards. So, yeah. Anyway, so as a summary, M.2 slots are less useful than PCIe slots because PCIe slots can be converted back into M.2 slots. The reverse is not true. This should have had dual BIOS functionality. This should have less dual BIOS functionality. And this could have been really, like, this could have benefited from the BCLK switches a bit. I mean, BCLK buttons a bit. So, yeah, that's it. That's the whole video. It's just like, we were so close to perfect. So close. So very close. And it's just like, nope, missed again. Like, and the funny thing is, like, MSI could have like asked me for like feedback on the Unify. Actually, I'm not sure if they did. It just didn't occur to me that they wouldn't include dual BIOS. Like, that's like a feature that I just expect as standard on any motherboard that considers itself for extreme overclocking. Right? Like, if you, like, because it used to be a standard feature. Like, if you look at old DDR3 boards that are targeted at overclockers, basically, even some of the cheap old DDR3 boards that aren't even really meant for, like, extreme overclocking have dual BIOS. Like, it's not even, like, it's not that rare. So I was just like, yeah, this is a $300 overclocking motherboard. Why wouldn't it have dual BIOS? Well, here we are. Oh, and then this board, I mean, this board I didn't have a chance to tell them, but they managed, apparently they like more like didn't have a chance to remind them of just how much I hate this functionality. But anyway, now I have. So hopefully we don't get a repeat of this situation next year, because like it's so annoying, especially the dual BIOS on this. Like, this is fine. Like, this is mostly like, oh, this motherboard would have been nicer if it had these extra functions, but this is just like, no, this is like straight up, I am not recommending this to people who, like, well, no, I'm not recommending it to people. Right? Like, unless you're going to use the motherboard on a test bench, like, this is so annoying to deal with. And even if you're on a test bench, this is so annoying to deal with. Like, just, like, I'd actually just recommend the Vision D instead. Or the Aorus Pro, which is cheaper. And that doesn't have the postcode, which is super annoying, but, like, it's less annoying than this. Yeah, anyway, that's it for the video. So thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe. Leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. I'd actually love to hear your thoughts on what I've, said here, because I'd like to have some validation that I'm correct about this. But I think I am. But anyway, yeah, so I'd love to hear your thoughts, and there's links. Oh, and if you'd like to support the channel, there's links in the description to the AHOC Patreon, and then also the AHOC Teespring store, where you can pick up shirts, stickers, posters, the usual YouTuber merch. Both Patreon and Teespring help out immensely with running the channel, so it would be much appreciated if you would check those links out. And that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.